So one of the tweets that just came back was that we completely ignored the subject of PR when we were going through that. So would anyone comment on PR and maybe even the agency role in sort of doing this tools and collective market analysis?
Absolutely. So I mean, PR is ultimately about how many impressions you get. It's also about telling the story. Well, if you understood the right story to tell and the way to tell that story and used it in a way that people actually, hey, I actually gravitate towards that, then that can be pretty interesting. And it's going to get picked up if you've got a set of metrics that pre-inform what that should be. If I can pre-inform what the set of stories are and how to wrap that set of stories in a specific set of language, where to go and drop the pebble from a PR standpoint. That's what PR is about, right? PR is about dropping the pebble.
How many people in the audience trust your PR agency to have a sense of social media metrics or analysis? Wow, that's a pretty damning statement. Any PR professionals in the audience who feel they do have a clue on social media metrics? Raise your hand high, you got a lot of customers coming at you. All right. Yeah, well, I would have to say I don't always see a lot of PR professionals being on the leading edge of looking at using these tools. However, the few that actually do are worth their weight in gold.
Dave, your team is right, though, because the way that's normally measured is the number of exposures in print in the newspaper. Same thing, like the Nielsen, as opposed to what are people talking about and then what are people talking about on the web. Would be a better way to track PR.
So one other survey question, how many people, so we've been talking about this sentiment analysis, or understanding both negative and positive impressions. How many people are using any type of tools to gather sentiment analysis with their marketing or campaigns? Okay, so that's probably quite less than 10% as far as I'm concerned. So let's talk a little bit about listening and the role of the vocal minority. So I think for many people who actually do listen, one of the challenges is how do you get a quantitative assessment of the people who are yelling at you, whether they like what you're doing or don't like what you're doing, what tools do you find are useful, and how do you accurately measure the vocal minority but not overemphasize the measurement? And actually, let's start with Michael and see if,
well, I think when you have the vocal minority, you have to understand first what the influence of that minority is, because there's a certain amount of vocal minority that doesn't have any influence over anyone, and they're basically just shooting off hot air, and you have to be able to identify the difference, as opposed to Michael Arrington or I don't know, someone like that hated your product or your campaign and started being very vocal about it. He might have a whole bandwagon of fanboys hop on and really attack against that. So I find it for tools to monitor that kind of stuff, I use just mostly, since I'm not on the measurement side, I don't really know I know BuzzMetrics has a number of sentiment tools and that kind of thing. But for me, and when I'm talking to people out there, I usually recommend some tools of, like kind of monitoring the conversation on Twitter, and even like Facebook is another place where you have a very good center of people.
Yeah, one thing I'd love to see both of you folks do, both at Nielsen and at Network Insights, is to do the marketer's equivalent of a Q score, where you take the people that really were super, super positive, the 9s and 10s, right, and divide it by the number of people who are the 1s and 2s that are super negative, like you do for movie stars, because frankly, that's the most appealing. If you have 0 negative, you probably don't have a lot of people turned on either. A lot of marketing is just vanilla. So it would really be cool if you could develop a metric like that, because we used to do that. We tried to do it actually together with DVD and Chrysler in the early 2000s. We wanted to have about 10% negative. Because we figured if you didn't have about 10% negative, you weren't having maybe 20% go way over the top. We wanted people to love us or hate us. We didn't much care about the middle, because we were only trying to get the 10% market share.
Kathy Sierra has a wonderful graphic on that, where being in the middle sucks, love or hate are great. So I think I've heard this talked about before as net promoter score, and I believe the way that most people calculate that is 9s or 10s get a +1, 8s are 0, and 7 or less are -1s, and then you add it up and try and see if you're above or below 0. A little bit different thing, I do some startup metrics for Pirates that are really focused on startups, and one thing I talk to them about is launching as early as you can to a small but statistically relevant audience or measurable audience, and then try to start to sample and test that score. And until you're actually above zero, you actually don't want to spend a lot of money. You don't want to spend a lot of money on marketing until you're actually getting that score above zero, because you're just spreading brand damage and wasting a lot of capital on that. Some other interesting tools that I think people are starting to use in doing this, user voice, get satisfaction. There's several other tools that people are starting to use as customer survey tools. Do you guys recommend or use any of those tools?
So I, certainly from a surveying standpoint, I think I use Twitter to actually figure out some of my surveying stuff. Not explicitly asking a question, but going across and understanding what the commentary and conversation is about from a semantic standpoint. If I can get to what that theme is that's going on in Twitter, I can then figure out, hey, where else is it happening across the web, and being able to understand that. I think back to the discussion of vocal minority. The vocal minority is like the loudest person in the room. Certainly, you need to understand the ripple effect of their influence and how influential is someone. But once you can get to a place where you understand that at a single location that person has contributed, that people then reading it and taking it somewhere else, and then they're going to contribute in a different location, but maybe they're influential there. So now you can understand that, that's pretty valuable, because then you can measure not only the drop of the pebble, but also the concentric circles that come out of it.
I personally am a huge fan of Get Satisfaction. How many of you know Get Satisfaction? Raise your hands. Okay, I'd say if you own a brand or a product, you should definitely get on Get Satisfaction. It's a very cool customer service tool. It's very transparent. It's very much what I think consumers are looking for, as a place to have a voice, to be heard and have feedback out in the open. I think some of the big things we've seen lately is when people were empowered to take their, when they receive, can you guys hear me?
I think they're putting you into the vocal minority.
Okay, so I'll just speak out loud. The Comcast network guy sleeping on the couch, bad customer service, posted on YouTube, all of a sudden, bad PR gets spread very fast. And then in the past, they've been able to cover up stuff like that. Now you can't, because you have all these transparent media outlets online. So Get Satisfaction, I think, is a great answer to that. Check it out if you haven't.
And so one of the things I find interesting about Get Satisfaction is whether or not you choose to use it, the community can start using it anyway. So there actually are conversations going on there that I think happen without you. A short anecdote, when I used to work for PayPal, when I first came there, I was running the developer program, and we didn't actually have our own forum and message boards. The guy who did a lot of our community worked on eBay's boards. This was before eBay bought the company. And the company's general impression was we didn't want to launch message boards because we were afraid that there was going to be so much negative feedback that that was not going to be good use of our resources. Unfortunately, these other two sites, PayPal Sucks and PayPal Warning, came up, and the conversation continued without us. I actually got an advisor on our developer board to launch message boards on our behalf, and we started using that. So I think one thing that I learned as a result of that is not engaging with your community doesn't mean the sentiment is not going to be there.